facing some very real threats now that the Taliban and al-Qaeda insurgents could entirely destabilize Pakistan and Afghanistan. As the administration searches for solutions, some analysts say part of the problem lies directly with the leaders of those nations. Joining us now is Joe Klein, columnist for Time magazine. Joe, good to see you. Well, first of all, you've written in Time magazine that both Richard Holbrooke and David Petraeus will do everything that they can to make sure that, to make sure that Zardari and to nudge Zardari and Karzai into being statesmen who occasionally act in their national interest, as Zardari, the Pakistani leader, seems to have done by deciding to fight the Taliban. It would be nice, you write, if, unlike Vietnam, our friends, quote, proved as competent as our enemies, but that is where the wishful thinking inevitably begins. So, now that I've butchered your very good writing, let's talk about your reporting, because you're on top of this like no one else. You've traveled there. You went with Richard Holbrooke on his most recent trip. How confident after this whole dog and pony show, maybe that's not putting enough confidence in what happened while they were here, but how confident after their week-long meetings are they that these two leaders can rise to the task?
Well, you know, they're sort of hopeful. I mean, what came out of those meetings were a series of breakthroughs, but they were process breakthroughs. They're not things, the sort of things that always translate to action on the ground. You finally have the militaries of Afghanistan and Pakistan talking to each other. You even have the intelligence services, the famed, notorious Pakistani ISI, which pretty much created the Taliban, is talking with the Afghan intelligence service. But we don't know whether that translates into action. There are really serious problems with both governments, and the most serious is this: they haven't provided basic services for their people. They haven't provided security, they haven't provided education, they haven't provided a legal system, and that's where the Taliban just jump in. One of the reasons why they succeeded in getting a toehold in SWAT was because they can provide a very rough and brutal form of justice that the government of Pakistan can't. And the same is true in Afghanistan.
Now, one of the things that we're now supposedly doing is sharing with the Pakistanis what we are learning from our predator raids. Is that because we trust them more, or is it because they're really demanding that as the price for continuing those raids?
Well, there's some dispute about whether we're actually sharing that now, because we were for a little bit, but some of that information was passed to the Taliban, which is the big problem here. You know, ISI, if it actually is on our side, it leaks like a sieve, and the fact is it may not be on our side. Elements there may not be on our side.
And one of the more frightening scenarios was one that I discussed the other day with Bruce Rydell on this program on Wednesday, where he, who had, of course, led the Pakistan and Afghanistan review for the White House on a 60-day period, is now back at Brookings and said very openly that there is real concern about the security of nuclear material, particularly if this Pakistani government collapses. Well,
you know, it's an interesting thing. Zardari, the president, the widower of Benazir Bhutto, is a neophyte. He really is in over his head. He was recently elected. It was a legacy election, and he's kind of let on in interviews that he's not quite sure how much and where, you know, where they're located, how many nukes and where they're located are. And so the Army is really in control here, and the Army traditionally we've been close to, but not so close over the last 12 or 16 years because we haven't been training their future leaders, and we don't know who those people are.
All right. Joe Klein, Time magazine.
Congresswoman Lynn Woolsey, and founder of the Out of Iraq Caucus. Congresswoman, thanks for your time tonight. Let's see here. The vote was 368 to 60. That's a Bush-like vote for the war, is it not? What's going on here?
Well, there just weren't enough members that think the way I do, that no more funds to keep our troops in Iraq. We want to bring them home, and no funds to send our troops to Afghanistan indefinitely without any kind of plan, without a mission, and absolutely knowing, Ed, that there is no military solution to Afghanistan.
Well, Congresswoman, I thought the Democrats across the country campaigned on change and brought a lot of new people into the process across the country. A lot of House seats won because we thought that this thing in Iraq was going to end. Is it going to cost this much money to get the heck out of there? What's going on here?
Well, actually, these funds aren't about bringing our troops home. If these funds for the Iraq part had been dedicated to bringing our troops and the military contractors out of there, Barbara Lee and Maxine Waters and I probably would have voted for it. But instead, it's to keep them there. They say no longer than the end of 2011, but I'm telling you, that's way too long.
Okay, so you would like, obviously, to see it stepped up and move faster. Do you think the president is caving into the generals?
Well, I think he inherited a mess. And I think there's a lot of members of Congress that want to give him the benefit of the doubt and give him this year to you know, untie the knots and get out of the mess. But I, for one, think that marching into Afghanistan is just going to prolong the mess. And instead of investing in human needs and in diplomacy, it's like it was almost 10-to-1 in that supplemental for the military over diplomacy.
And Congresswoman, I just want to bring this up. We have no trouble giving money to Wall Street. We're tight with the dollar when it comes to the automobile manufacturers in this country. A lot of people lost their job yesterday and will over the weekend with the closings of these dealerships. Yet we hardly have any debate or conversation in the media in this country over another $100 billion to Iraq and Afghanistan. Is this ever going to change, in your opinion?
Well, Ed, I think it must. We must have a smarter policy. We must join the 21st century. We have to know that there has to be another way besides militarily to solve our differences.
All right,
otherwise, what are we going to do as a human species?
Congresswoman Lynn Woolsey, thanks for your time tonight. Thanks for weighing in on this. Tom Andrews is the National Director of Win Without War and a former congressman from Maine. It's more of the same. I thought at least that there would be more of a reduction of funding, but this is one of the biggest 4-month allocations of money we've seen ever. What's your response?
Well, Ed, I think the whole thing is very disturbing, and I think it's a wake-up call for those of us, of course, who campaign for these Democrats who are going to very clearly turn this thing around. I mean, look at what happened in this debate. There was a congressman from Massachusetts, Jim McGovern. He said, look, before we give all this money to this Afghanistan policy, let's at least require the administration to come back to us with an exit strategy. Didn't say when we were going to come home or how we were going to come home. Just present us with an exit strategy before we give you all this additional money. Well, he wasn't even allowed to bring that to the floor for even a vote. But when the Republicans objected to the president's request for money to shut down that blight called Guantanamo Bay, the Democrats responded by taking that money out and saying, we're not going to give any money to taking out that Guantanamo Bay unless you provide us with a plan for closing it. So it's disturbing, not just the outcome, but also how we got to that outcome.
Are the Democrats forgetting who took them to the dance?
Well, apparently that is the case, and I think what's happening is that they're getting intimidated by, in this case, Republicans and Karl Rove, who says that, look, the Democrats, you know, once we shut down Guantanamo Bay, we're going to have terrorists in American neighborhoods all over the country. It's like you're going to see Abu Zubaydah in the local Starbucks 2 weeks from now. And the Democrats, instead of fighting, standing up and saying, no, there's a reason the Americans stood for change in November. There's a reason when the president said he was going to close Guantanamo Bay that the Americans supported this, and we're going to close that place down because it's not only a blight on our character and who we are as a country, but it's also being used as one of the most powerful recruitment tools that terrorists have. Instead of making that argument on the floor of the House and fighting for that, they simply withdrew the proposal, took the money off the table, and demanded that the president come back with more of a plan.
I don't mean this to be a cheap shot, but is this change we can believe in? I mean, I want out of Iraq. I understand the 17,000 more troops going into Afghanistan. But I thought we've been told time and time again that the Iraqi people had to stand up for themselves. Is this change we can believe in at this point?
Well, clearly the Iraqi people want us to get out, and certainly there's going to be instability, there's going to be violence, there's a lot of compromises that still have yet to be made in Iraq. But the bottom line is that Iraq should be controlled and run by Iraqis. 80% of Iraqis want that. Most Americans want that. That's what they should be. That's what they should be given. As a matter of fact, Ed, 80% of Afghanis do not want to see a military escalation in Afghanistan. Well, they think it's going to make things worse.
But there's terrorist camps there, and I understand addressing that. Tom, thanks for joining us tonight. Appreciate your time.